Welcome. I'm Dawn with K Squared Technologies. And today's exploration is on our monthly webinar, we're going to be looking at Microsoft Excel, specifically getting started with macros. This is part one of a two-part series, and we're going to then continue that next month. So what exactly is a macro? The first thing to know in Microsoft Excel, there isn't anything extra you need to do. That is, you don't need to buy any extra programs, and you don't even need to have programming experience. But a macro is a way to automate tasks that you're already currently doing, but you're performing them manually. So consider those actions, those things that you're doing. That might be repetitive tasks. Maybe it's preparation of a monthly report. Maybe it's how you handle data you download from different systems. So that's the first thing to consider is what is it that you are doing on a regular basis that you might want to automate? And this is where a macro could come in. It could just be something simple like a series of formatting actions. So with a macro, we can capture those steps, those actions, so we can repeat them over and over again. And that's the basic foundation of working with that. So although you want to have, spring experience with Excel, you don't have to have any, extensive experience or additional tools to be able to build macros with that. Now, this is just going to be today, this month and next month. It'll really just be a good place to get started. And for many of you, it may be all that you need to know. But understand as well that the world of macros is very deep and broad. And it truly, there are, 2-week courses on all the different elements of what you could do. But for most people that I work with, just being able to create some of these simple repetitive tasks can be a huge time saver for you and really help you with your productivity. So let's look at what today looks like. We're first of all going to, just throughout, you'll get the sense of how we can plan out our macros. That is, what do we need to put into place or just consider as we're building those. And then you'll have a chance to see me run a simple macro, kind of what's behind that, what are some of the options for that, and of course, then what are the steps to create a macro. Now we'll continue in part 2 of this series, we'll continue not only creating macros, but really dive more into how we could even edit these routines. So that's our plan as we move forward in this learning, but know that we'll cover all those basics for you this month and next month. So I hope that you'll have lots of great takeaways on how you can really take advantage of and utilize macros in Excel. So let's start with some key macro basics. First of all, one of the reasons why I said you don't have to have programming experience is that you can take some of those routines and actually just record them in Excel. So that's where some of the preparation comes in place. And then Excel will capture those steps so you can replay them. Or you can either create or edit macros using a Visual Basic Editor. So it's good to know the foundation of these macros, whether you record them automatically or you write them out, is something called VBA or Visual Basic for Applications. So it is the programming language that underlies these macros in Excel, but it comes with Excel. So here again, no additional programs you need to purchase or work with. So there we'll make a couple changes so that we understand how we can set up Excel for success with this, but those are some of the pieces. So we'll hop into and do more with Visual Basic Editor in part 2 of this training. But as we were recording our macros, that's where we're going to start with that. It's good to know as well where you want to store them. So when you're creating a macro, you'll be given some different choices by Excel. One could be to something called the Personal Macro Workbook. And that is a local file And that's where you store those macros that are, we'll say, more global to your system. Maybe that's a formatting macro, something that you want to use over and over in different workbooks. But it could be that you want to store a macro in the current active workbook. That might be a situation, let's say that you have a template or a file you open up. So for instance, that data that you might download from another system, you could perhaps create an Excel file where you then copy that data, and then from there, that file you copied it into stores the macro to perform those actions. That is, it might be a series of steps that really only apply to a particular kind of data, so it doesn't make sense to put it in your global or personal macro workbook. So that means the workbook itself stores that macro. So that becomes another way to work with it. Now, the personal macro workbook, even though it might not even be apparent to you, it opens automatically when you open Excel. That means it's always sitting there in the background waiting for you to call on those routines or those macros that you've created. So it's not workbook specific. But if you have a particular file, let's just say it's your monthly report template or something else that you're using with that, the macros in that will only work when that file is open. So not necessarily does that file have to be the active one, but it does need to be open. So that's a good thing to keep in mind, because the personal macro workbook is local to you. It's more difficult to be able to share the macros that you create in there. Now, although this might not, if you're brand new to macros, this might not be the first thing to consider, but some organizations, some teams will actually create a workbook that contains commonly used macros. Let's say you have someone who's a little bit more of an Excel expert. You might create these macros in that workbook, but that workbook is available for other people to open, or that workbook would be shareable, so people can have copies of it. And if that workbook is sitting in the background, that would be another option to make it more shareable. So that's another element that's a little twist on this, but most typically it either is that you're performing work in a workbook that contains one or more macros, or you have macros that are stored locally. So that's kind of what we'll keep in mind in terms of working with these. Now, it's also can be helpful just to know, as you're looking at the different work that you have, what these files are, what they look like. So remember, the personal macro workbook is something that when you create a macro that you say you want to go there, it will automatically create, if it needed, and then store the macro in this file. If it's a workbook that contains a macro, then this needs to be saved as a macro-enabled workbook. So it will be a file that has an extension .xlsm. And that's important to know because our default Excel workbook cannot store macros. This is a security component. This is designed so that malware, malicious program code cannot be easily introduced to your system. So you actually have to, enable the content or allow these macros to be available to you. So our default workbook is the .xlsx extension, and that cannot store macros. So that's just something, a good thing to know in terms of how you plan out or work with these. These are some of the other pieces there. Now, it's possible, although it's been a lot of years since we've made these changes, that you might have some old Excel workbooks that have the XLS extension. Now, unless you need these to be used in some other system, because there are some other programs we might use within our industry where it requires these old formats. So unless you have to have that workbook in the .xls, then those old workbooks could store macros. And that's one of the reasons why this change was made now, over 10 years ago. So in that case, if you don't have any reason why it has to be in that old extension, then those files should be converted primarily because then you can take advantage of a lot of other features that are available in Excel. So those are some of the file extensions and file formats that you might run into and want to cover that for you. Certainly do let me know in chat if there's any questions or something you need to clarify. Also know that all of our monthly webinars are made available on our YouTube channel. So you would be able to go back and review this as well once those are made available. Now, once you have macros, then there's multiple ways for you to replay them. Because remember, the whole point of it is this is something that you're going to use on an ongoing basis or a repetitive basis. So what are some of our playback options? Well, the long way, but certainly one of the ways is through what's called the macro dialog box. So that would be one way for you to replay it. That will show you a list of all the available macros. That is either macros that are in the personal macro workbook or files that are in an open Excel workbook. You can, when you create the macro or even afterwards, assign a keyboard shortcut to it. So that becomes another one. And I'm going to walk through a couple examples so you'll be able to see how this all applies. But I want to give you this foundation so that you can start considering how macros might work for you. We can also add an icon for the macro either to our Excel Quick Access toolbar or to the ribbon. Now, we would want to do that only for those macros that would be more global, that is in that personal macro workbook, because things like the Quick Access toolbar are open all the time or available to us all the time. So we don't want to use more specialty macros that we only need with a particular workbook. We could actually create a button within a spreadsheet. So it could, whether it's an icon, a square, a circle, it could be an image, all of those things that actually could say, click here, or could have instructions that would run that macro as well. So sometimes that's helpful when we have a complex worksheet that we have different sort and filter orders, and we could use a macro for that. And there are workbooks, there are macro names that are specific to various actions, like when a workbook opens. So when a workbook opens, and it has that workbook, that macro name, then it would perform those actions. So those are some of the different approaches. Our most common typically is a keyboard shortcut or perhaps adding it to the Quick Access toolbar. So we won't necessarily be able to get to all of these things in this session, but you'll get a chance to see some ideas for this in part 2 as well. So those are some of our playback options. Want to at least give you some consideration in terms of what your choices are. Now, when we're creating a macro, you'll also be asked to name it. So there are some different things to keep in mind there too. First of all, the name of the macro, it should be descriptive, and it must begin with a letter. So you can have numbers, letters, or the underscore character, but the macro name must begin with a letter. You can have up to 255 characters in length. You don't usually need to get that detailed with it, but you want to make sure that it's not a generic name. Just don't call it print, but you could call it print monthly report. But keeping in mind, you either don't want any spaces, no spaces. You could use the underscore characters in between. But one of the things that's helpful when you're naming is use something called title case. So title case would mean that if I was creating something print monthly report, then I would capitalize the P, capitalize the M, and the R. So that way it's a little bit more readable. Absolutely not required. It's not case sensitive with that, but the title case can help you as well. So no other punctuation except for the underscore. And those we'll say rules or guidelines, those things will help you And you'll notice if you name a macro with a space, then you won't be able to continue to the next step. So those are some things to kind of keep in mind as we start looking hands-on at how we work with macros. So let's go ahead and dive in and explore macros in Excel. And let's come into Excel. So one of the things that's helpful to keep in mind is that as you're preparing for them, of course, you want to define where you want to store them, what you want to call them, how you might want to bring them back, and know that you do not have to try to invent all of these different actions. There are probably millions of different resources. That is, the how-to, the programming language, the steps that might be involved are available in so many different places with just a quick Google search often. But of course, then you really need to kind of know where you're heading and need to have a good understanding of the basics at the very least. So know that there are a lot of different ways that we can start building those instructions, but we want to get started with some of the basics. It's also good to know the keyboard shortcuts because macro, when it's recording, is very literal. So that means, for instance, if I'm going left with my arrow key, that's a little bit different action than if, for instance, I say I just want to hit the home key to go to the beginning of the line. If you type something and then you say, oops, and you make a correction, except the macro is not going to capture that. It's only going to capture whatever you had at the final entry when you hit enter. So that's another thing as well that can be helpful to keep in mind. So let's get ourselves ready to work with macros. One of the first things we want to do is we want to enable the developer tab. So if we look at our ribbon in Excel, we're going to add a new tab to that in working with it. So there's a couple different ways to get to this. I could go to File Options, but I could also right-click on the ribbon and left-click on Customize the ribbon. So it just takes me either way, whether it's File Options, here I'm in the Customize Ribbon tab, and this is a way to get set up. So what we are looking for over on the right-hand side, it's available in Excel, but not automatically enabled, and that is the Developer tab. So I just simply check this, and we go to OK. So now I have the Developer tab available. Now, don't worry, we won't be focused on too many of these actions here. Most of our work will just be over here on the left-hand side in this code group. So that hopefully will help you feel like, uh-oh, what am I getting myself into? Don't be concerned with that. Now, the View tab has a few. Under the View tab at the far right-hand side, it also has a little macros drop down. This is just a way for you to quickly view macros, record them, and use the relative references, which we'll talk about. But the Developer tab makes it a little bit easier in having these things be a little bit more upfront. So that's why we enable it. Now, like a lot of other changes you make in Excel, once you enable this, you don't have to keep doing it every time you start Excel. So hopefully that makes that a little bit easier for you as well. So let's look at an example of a workbook that contains macros, and I'll show you a little bit so you can get a kind of a sense of how this might work. So first of all, I'm going to open up a file, and I just want to show you where this idea once again about these file extensions here. So file I'm going to open here is called Running Macros. It just has a macro in it so you can see some examples of that. And notice that the file type is macro enabled worksheet versus a regular Excel worksheet. So this is the one that has the extension .xlsm. Okay, so that's what we have at this point then. Now, I'm going to go ahead and open it. And here's one of the things that you'll also see will happen. So notice here that there is, in this yellow, is a security warning. And it's telling you that macros have been disabled. So this is the default. The intention of this is that we want to actively or knowingly enable these or have these macros available. So this is the reason why workbooks that contain macros now have a different extension. That way we can then, agree or know that this is something that we would say is a safe source. Now, if it's an attachment that you receive and you're not sure about the source, that's the whole point, is just to be able to make sure that this is safe. Now, I realize a lot of things there's tools so that a lot of these, anything that might be malicious is typically caught before it gets to this particular point. And so, that's certainly one of the real advantages of working with an organization like K-Square Technologies, is that, this IT support is available for you. But in this case, I'm going to enable the content so that in this case, I will make this a trusted document. So because it's an internal one that maybe I've used before. So my intention with this is that I have a macro that would typically, for this kind of purpose, it would typically be part of my personal macro workbook, but I want you to demonstrate this. So it's a macro that's going to do a couple things. It will, first of all, you have a certain formatting that you like for column headings. So I'm going to select this row for the column headings. The macro is going to do multiple things. It's going to apply word wrap. So wrap text, which is one of the options here. Okay. It will center the content and it will format. So it's going to make it bold, centered, and wrap the text. And in this case, then I select, and here's the other thing too, this macro is not selecting the content for you, because it might be row 4 in one case, it might be row 1 in another case. You may only want to select certain cells to apply this to. And so when it's a formatting or editing macro, keep that in mind, that it may not be helpful to have the macro actually do the highlighting or selecting for you, unless it's something that's always the same. So let's say it's a monthly download, and I'm always going to select column B and delete it. Well, then that would be something you'd include in the macro. But in this case, I want to have the flexibility to apply it in different ways. So I've selected the content I want to apply this to. This macro happens to have a keyboard shortcut assigned to it, and that is Control-Shift-C. Now, that isn't something that's just built in, so just know this is something specific to this macro to run this. So let's go ahead and try that. Control-Shift-C. So in this case, then, I have now applied that. Wrap text, bold, and center. So let's try that again with another one. In this case, it's row 1. I'll select that. Now I could select the individual cells or the entire row. Just know I'm applying the formatting all the way across. It doesn't make the file that much larger, but that may or may not be what you want to do. Once again, Control-Shift-C. Right? Now I'll have one more. Now, if I didn't want to do that, or I didn't have a keyboard shortcut associated with it, then I could go in my developer, and here are my macros. And here is the one that I have available. It's called column titles. So notice the naming on that. And so even if I didn't have a keyboard shortcut assigned to it, I could run that. Now, where did the keyboard shortcut come from? The keyboard shortcut was something that I assigned when I created it, but I didn't have to. I could also here under options. So this is in the macros dialog box. In options, this is where I can see what has been assigned to it. And it even has an optional description. So we're going to talk a little bit more about these keyboard shortcuts here because there's some rules around those as well. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and run it. And there we go. So that is the idea of taking a macro that we can then use repetitively within our work. Now, in this particular case, it's stored in this particular workbook. However, if because I have it available to me, I could actually apply that or use it in another workbook if I wanted to. But notice only if it was open. So if I, for instance, just had a blank workbook here, and let's just say that I have some titles, and I'll we'll create these and say I want to do my January. Well, that's not going to be very, I can't wrap that text very much, huh? Okay. So just for a very simple example, if I highlighted these and used that keyboard shortcut, notice that even though I'm not in this, even in the same workbook, I'm actually able to use those actions. So that's kind of the idea about having a, a macros workbook if you had a lot of these repetitive things that you wanted to be able to also share with your team. So that might be a little, like I said, that might be more to consider than you need to right now, but that's kind of the whole idea there. Now, I'm going to go ahead and delete that row just so I'm ready for my, for what I'm going to do with this particular blank one here in just a moment. So a couple quick things. What we just did there in terms of running the formatting those headings, in terms of working with that. Okay, that is those actions, although it worked just fine, there isn't undo. So that's one of the things that can be a little bit unexpected in terms of how macros work. And also notice that as you were recording as we record macros, it records everything. So it's very literal. So that's one of the things too. But the undo, even though we see it as performing a series of different actions, it just runs the macro. So you do need to make sure that you test it or make sure you have good backup copies of whatever you're applying it to, because you don't want to risk key data when you're first getting started with these macro ideas. So that's something to keep in mind too. So what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to demonstrate the creation of a macro. In this case, it's going to be, the first thing I'll say is, we're creating a macro that you will never need again. I know that might seem rather odd, but the whole point of it is I'm going to show you creating a macro that will perform a number of different actions, just so that you can see what's possible. So the point of this particular macro, although it really isn't going to be something that I would use again, will demonstrate a number of different things. It's going to demonstrate, for instance, entering content. It will show you navigation. It will also give us a chance to apply some formatting. And so all of those different things might be, common in a macro that you're working with. So we're going to create a macro from scratch and go ahead and see how this works. So just keep in mind, this is not one, I promise we'll look at how we can do something that might be useful, like what we just looked at. But for this is just to give you some of the concepts of building them, because I encourage you between now and next month that if macros are brand new to you, that you try a few of them just to see how that applies. So first of all, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to save this and save it to wherever. Oh, I did not want to save it as book 1, so let's go ahead and try this again. All right, I want to call this my practice macros. So I got a little bit too enthusiastic about that, and that makes a little bit more sense. So I've saved this file as practice macros. And now what I want to do, I'm going to, first of all, I want to make sure that I'm in the right starting location. So this is a macro. So just imagine this is something maybe you are formatting downloaded data or a monthly report, something like that. You want to make sure that you are in whatever the starting location might be. It might not be A1, but we don't want to be in the macro and then say, oops, I need to be over here, because that can sometimes cause us to have errors in our macro. Next, I'll go to my developer. Now, we're going to be recording a macro here, but there's one element that I want to enable, and that is use relative references. Now, I'll share this with you either in this session or next month, a little bit more about this. It's another example. But what this means, and you may be familiar with that. For instance, a relative reference. You create a sum formula and then you copy it to the right. Well, the cell references inside are relative to the location. So the formula might have been in cell B10, and then you copy it to the right and it goes to cell C10. And it means we don't have to create a sum for every single column. So a relative reference means, in this case, I want this to be a series of steps that I might not do at A1. The next time I run it, it might be at D4. Okay, so, or a different location. So enabling relative reference doesn't mean you always want it to be turned on. You might want it to be capturing the literal position. That is, for certain projects, you may always want it to go to A1. And then you want it to go to and select column B, and then move to C5, whatever that might be. In that case, we don't want this to be pushed in. So if you have navigation that is specific to, and you want it to stay in that location, then you just need to consider whether or not you absolutely want it to go to those places, or you want it to have the flexibility depending upon where you start it. So for this one, I want to use relative references. I'm going to go ahead here and start record macro. And what I'm going to call this then is, I'll just call this my new macro. Okay. Now here's my shortcut key. Here's the challenge. We really can't just do a control combination. So this hasn't changed for many years in Excel. The problem with the shortcut key is basically, I'd say all the control combinations are already taken. So whether it's Control A or Control B and continuing, those are already spoken for. So you'd end up overriding the existing purpose or intention. So we can't just do a control combination. You'll want to look at keyboard shortcuts that use Shift. Now you still need to test those out prior to starting this to make sure that those aren't already assigned. So in this case, I'm going to do a Shift N for new. Now I didn't hold down Control, that was already assumed. So that's another piece here. So I've got my macro name. It doesn't have a space. I'm using title case in this situation. I've assigned a keyboard shortcut. I can always assign that later. And where do I want to store it? Now for this practice, it will be in this workbook, but we'll see how we can do macros as well. That would be in the personal macro workbook. So in this first session, we needed to set some foundation, and then we'll spend really almost all of our time next month on more hands-on things. So in this case, I'm going to store it in this workbook, but you can see the other options here and an optional description. Now this will go into the macro language as a comment. So it can be helpful for other people as they are maybe, sharing or working with these as well. So in this case, I'll go ahead and okay. Now, some of you may have already, considered, like, didn't she say that macros need to be stored in different kinds of files? And absolutely. So notice here, Phoebe projects, which is basically what we're creating, must be saved in macro enabled workbooks. So I'm going to save this when I finish, just so that I don't interrupt the parts here, because we've already started recording. But know that for this to work and for me to be able to save it, I need to save this as a macro enabled workbook. So that was on purpose that I did not do that right up front, just because this will likely happen to you too. So notice that I've got this stop recording. It's pretty subtle. And there's a similar little box down in my status bar as well. So it's just hiding here. This is how I could click it to stop recording, but that's pretty subtle. So there is not giving you a lot of information about that. Now, all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to type a list of items. Okay, so you could do this as well. So just so you could kind of practice the concepts before you start doing something that might be more important. So for this, I'm just going to put in my name, favorite color, favorite food, and I'll be good, and I'll put it in fruit. Okay, now that was data entry, navigation. Now I'm going to come up here, highlight my name, and I want to format it. So let's say, for instance, let's make that big, okay? And I'll change the color to it as well. And I'll go ahead and make that blue. Now, normally, if this wasn't recorded, because keep in mind, it's still recording, it might be very tempting when you're creating a macro that you would simply look at this and say, okay, if I want to do the column width, I'm just going to come over here to this divider here to the right-hand side of column A and just double click to auto fit or drag it out. And that might be fine depending upon your application. But keep in mind, Excel is literal. So Excel is actually capturing how wide I make that. And if this content, if you're creating content or formatting content that could vary, you may not want it to do that best fit. Instead, what I'm going to do here, just so you can kind of get a sense of how these kinds of things work, is instead I'm going to come up here in Home, go over to Format, and there's a difference between manually enabling the auto fit to now under Format, auto fit column width. So it will perform this action regardless of what the content might be. And now it will make it wider. Now, the last part of a macro might be, or just consider, how do you want it to end? Now, this might be all I need. I could just say I'm done, but I'm going to press Control Home. So here again, I'm capturing another part of the navigation, and now I'm finally done. So let's go back to the developer and stop recording. This is probably the biggest mistake, especially when you're first getting started with macros, is we do all these things and then we forget to stop recording. So it keeps going on and on and on, and then we definitely have to edit. So that's another consideration here as well. So I'll stop recording so I have this macro. So let's first of all kind of get things all kind of cleaned up here. First of all, I need to test whether or not this works. But mentioned before that we need to make sure that it's in a workbook enabled or macro enabled workbook. So I'll do File, Save As, and here I need to change this from an Excel workbook to a macro enabled workbook. And that's the XLSM. So it can actually store macros. Otherwise that macro is not going to be, it's just sitting in memory right now. So now in this case, now I have two workbooks in the same location with a very similar, same name, but different extensions. So that's one of the things to watch out for. So I'll go ahead and save here. Now, let's test this out. Let's see what happens in working with this. I'll go ahead and create move to a new sheet in this workbook. Okay. And I'm going to move to a different location. Because remember, we have that relative references enabled, meaning that it should not have to be in cell A1. Now, it doesn't mean that it's always should be relative references, just it's helpful to think through and plan. How will I apply this? Is it important that it goes to that particular location, or is it based upon wherever I want to launch it? So now my shortcut, Control-Shift-N for new, and there we go. So you could kind of see some of the steps there, and notice I did the Control Home, which took me back here. So those are the different steps. Hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the things you could do in a macro, some of the actions that are possible. We're going to certainly dig in and do more with how we can edit this macro and how we can see some of the actions and how we can work with that. But I want to, before we wrap up today, I want to give you an opportunity to at least see a macro that you might actually be able to apply. So keep this one in mind for, as we meet back together again next month, or as you review the recording on that. But let's go ahead and create another macro that could be stored in the personal macro workbook, something that would be more applicable. So here we got a chance to see some of the things that could be captured. I'm going to go ahead and switch over then to another workbook. And so this is a situation, this is just a standard Excel workbook. I don't need to save it as a macro enabled because I'm using it as a practice. Maybe it's a copy of a monthly report or a download of data. So you're just using, most macros we create against, or we build them off of existing data, off an existing worksheet. So I have this workbook. Now the macro is going to be stored in the personal macro workbook. So it's not going to be stored in this workbook. That means it's available to me to other files as well. That's the important thing too. This macro will be very much like what I demonstrated before, one that applies formatting to the column headings. And keep in mind, even if you didn't have the content in there yet, you could apply the formatting to that as you're building out the worksheet. So I'm simply going to select this just so I can practice the creation of and capturing those steps. We go back to the developer. And certainly let me know if you need to have any kind of clarification, you can drop that into chat. We go to the developer and I'm going to record a macro. So for this one, I'll call it my headings. Here again, the more descriptive, the more helpful. And so this might be where, I call it, my report headings or my bold headings, things like that. And optional keyboard shortcut. So if you do assign a keyboard shortcut, it's good to keep track of them because you're still going to be a bit limited. Remember, it's a Control Shift and a letter combination. You can't use numbers. I know it'd be nice if you could. You can't use the Alt key. So pretty, like I said, pretty restricted on that. So I'll call this, do a Shift H for my headings. And where do I want to store it? I want to store it in my personal macro workbook. Okay. So it's not stored in this workbook. It's stored in this, we'll say more global. And so this is going to format, selected cells with wrap text, bold. And actually, I like to do the bold first because it, and any other formatting, because that can change how much space the content needs often, and center. Okay. So those are the different actions that I'm going to put into this one. Now, we're going to go ahead and say, okay. The recording mode is on. You don't see anything really different just because it's being stored in a different place here. But the first thing I'm going to do here is make it bold. Okay. I'll wrap text and center. That's all I need. Now, optionally, if I wanted to, I'd already had it selected. I might just let it pause here, but you could optionally hit the home key or control home or something along those lines if you wanted it to clear that selection. So if I hit the home key, for instance, now it is capturing that keystroke and it is no longer selected. So now I'll go back to developer and stop recording. So now I've created a global macro. This is one that I not only can use in other parts of this practice, but I could use it in other workbooks. I don't have to have any other workbooks open. So it would be something that I could apply in that way. So hopefully that's giving you some inspiration and some ideas. Let's go ahead and try that again. I'll go ahead and select the cells I want to apply it to. Control Shift H for heading. And we'll try it one more time. Okay. Control Shift H. So that's the idea in terms of working with it, that I could continue applying and practicing those actions. So those things, yes, I could do those manually, but it's likely you're going to have a lot more things that are than just those 3 formatting actions. I want you to think about, as you continue your work with Excel, what are those things that might be taking up too much time that you keep doing every day or every week or every month? How could a macro help you with that? How could a macro make it easier for you so that you could automate some of those steps? That's one of the things that I want you to really kind of keep in mind as we start applying or looking at these different examples here. So let's add one more to our options before we wrap up today. And then, as I mentioned, next month, we're going to really dig into more. We'll see some of the instructions behind what we created. We'll see how we can edit these. We'll see how we can otherwise manage them. And you'll get a chance to get a better understanding of other ways that we can automate and run them. So right now we've run it through a keyboard shortcut and through the dialog box. Going to go ahead here and I'll clear the formatting on this to just make it a general format. So, because this is how our content starts off. Now, what if you had something that was a common format for you? Now, it could be something you apply to the whole worksheet, but maybe you want to apply it to selected cells, a specific column, anything along those lines. So let's take that idea of formatting and creating a simple macro for that. Here's the idea. Now, keep in mind once again, and I'll go ahead here and I'm going to close this running macros workbook so it doesn't, I don't want to have any confusion about what is causing certain things to work with us, okay? And I'll close my practice one for right now as well, just so that we can know that we're only, we're just using this one for our practice. So I want to have it be something for formatting. Now, just so that you can see the extent of it, I will also not only have it be a number format option, but I'll also apply some font formatting to it, which might be way more than what you would typically do. But there might be situations where you, for certain values, conditional formatting may not work, and you want to just be able to go to that cell and, okay, I want to make that green, bold, and italics. Well, you could do that through the ribbon, but if you're doing it multiple times throughout the day, it might be great for you to have a macro. So here's the idea. I'm going to select the cells that I want to apply this to. So here again, I'll just select some cells for practice. Next, we'll go to Developer and record macro. And I'll call this my comma format. Okay. So this will be my Shift C. Now I close, just so I don't confuse things, I close the file that had that shortcut in it. In this case, this shortcut Control Shift C is going to be stored in the personal macro workbook. So yeah, you can sometimes run into those conflicts, and you just want to be aware of and keep track of these different shortcuts. Okay, comma format for reports. Go ahead and okay. Now, what do I want this to be? Well, let's say it is that I want it to be the comma format. And just so that you can kind of see how it can stand out, I want it to be italics, bold, and let's go ahead and make it green as well. Okay. Just so that you can see those different actions. Now, I don't have any navigation going on here, and I didn't have, and so that was why I wasn't too concerned here. When I did the other one and I did hit home, I had relative references on. So I do want to touch on that because that's an important piece there that I hadn't mentioned before. That is, if there is no navigation, we don't have to be concerned about whether it's relative or absolute. But when it does have navigation, you want to answer that question, in terms of how that might work, or whether or not how you want to work with that. In this case, I'm just going to stop recording. So now this means that I can go to any location, and it doesn't have to be in this workbook. It could be in others. So for instance, here I have this selected, Control Shift C for comma, and I've been able to apply that formatting very easily. So that would also be true for anything else that I might open up as well. For that, I could even go to a new blank workbook, okay, and I could select the whole column, Control Shift C, and now as I start typing values, it automatically will take on that format. So that's how it's working for you in terms of it's storing it in our personal macro workbook, and it has those available for any workbooks that you have. That's something just important to kind of keep in mind in working with that. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to dig into more editing and understanding the Visual Basic Editor in our next session. I want you to consider, though, what macros might be helpful for you, and maybe start creating a few just to see how that works for you. And then we'll give you some more tools next month in terms of how you work with them. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind for as you move forward with this. Now, one of the things here, let's go back to, and I'm going to switch over here. I've got just a little bit of time, so well, I won't go to, I'll just create a brand new one. That might be a little faster than trying to switch that one for some reason. I just want to show you the difference between the concept of a relative versus an absolute macro. So these will be very quick ones. Once again, these aren't ones that you're going to do for yourself. That is, you won't say, oh, wow, I really needed to know that one. So I'm going to go back to developer. I'm going to record macro. And this is just going to be, relative practice. I won't even give it a keyboard shortcut. I'm going to save it in this workbook so you can see the idea. And all I want to see that the relative reference is on. Say this is relative, meaning it has to do with the location for it. And I'll type in blue and I'll type in fruit. Okay. Now, that's relative. Now I'm going to come over and go to a different location and notice here, right, I'm in the middle of the macro, but I'm going to turn off the relative reference. So this is absolute. And I'll type in red. All right. And now we'll control home and we'll stop recording. So here again, we can explore this also in a little bit more detail next month. What should happen here, and what I want you to see, is if I move to a different location, and in fact, here I'll go to a new sheet, but I'll start it over here. Now we'll go to our macros. Here's my relative practice, and notice, by the way, here are my other macros I put in my personal macro workbook. So here's my practice, and I'm going to run it. And notice what happened. Okay. This is relative. Now I went over here. That was a relative move, and then I changed it. So that's one of the things that happened is if I really wanted this to be absolute here, I should have changed it before I actually moved over to that location. So what it recorded was go over 2 cells to the right. That was relative. But then when I hit enter and it was absolute, it said go to C2, go to C3. So those are some things that you could try as well, just to get a sense for the difference between relative and absolute. Keeping in mind, it's not that one is better than the other, they're just different. And they have different applications in working with your macros. So we're going to continue this as we next month. And I definitely just want to give you a good, hopefully good starting place. Now, the thing to know as well, when I exit out of Excel, I'm going to be prompted to save that personal macro workbook. So it hasn't saved it until I exit out of Excel. So, know that that's another piece to this as well. All right. I hope that that's given you a good start for how you can work with macros, and know we're going to continue that exploration, that journey next month. So please register for that and look for the recording in our YouTube channel as well. So next month, we're going to continue in exploring what we've just created with these, how we can edit these macros, how we can run them in other ways, what are the options. And then we're going to shift into Microsoft Word in September. So there we'll have a different ways to automate things and working with tables and working with forms. So that's what we've got coming up here in our ongoing webinar session. We typically offer these on the second Tuesday of each month. So definitely check your emails for future sessions as we have those. And I hope you'll join us again, certainly for next month as a continuation for that. When we finish in a few minutes, you'll see Zoom will pop up a survey. This is always a great way for you to provide feedback and to share any other topics that you'd like to see as we start planning for the rest of the year and into next year. My gosh, we're already starting to look into next year. But that's our look at getting started with macros in Microsoft Excel. So how can we help you to be more productive? Please reach out to us for IT services and consulting to support you with your Microsoft technologies. Thanks for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you next month.